Welcome to the third part of our deep dive into the Final Fantasy XV community survey that we pushed out last month. For this analysis video, we're going to be looking into what the 2,602 respondents to the survey thought about Final Fantasy XV's downloadable content. We're therefore going to be taking a pretty deep look into everyone's thoughts on the paid and free pieces of DLC contained within the Season Pass, like the Holiday Pack and episode Prompto. On top of that, we're also going to see which free update people have enjoyed the most. For your reference, in the past two videos, we looked at general comments around Final Fantasy XV itself and the overarching Final Fantasy XV universe. I'd recommend checking them out after you're done with this video. Now, downloadable concept is still quite a new concept within the mainline Final Fantasy games. Our first taste came with Final Fantasy XIII Part 2, where alongside small items like accessories, costumes, weapons and bonus Colosseum battles, there were also some story scenarios, one of which, called Lightning's Story, Requiem of the Goddess, was a compulsory purchase if you wanted to see the game's true ending. Needless to say, fans weren't too happy about that, and for the DLC associated to Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, Square Enix decided to steer clear of anything remotely related to story content. In an interview prior to its release, Yoshinori Kitase explicitly promised that the main story would conclude within the content included on the game disc, and they were true to their word. With Final Fantasy XV, however, Hajime Tabata took the decision to jump back into the DLC fray, offering a season pass for the first time in the history of the franchise. It would contain 6 pieces of downloadable content, 3 of which would be story scenarios related to Gladiolus, Prompto, and Ignis. And this brings us nicely onto our first piece of data relating to downloadable content, the fact that 60.87% of respondents decided to go ahead and purchase the Final Fantasy XV Season Pass. This was actually somewhat surprising to me because of what I've just mentioned. Fans were extremely critical the last time Square Enix decided to use DLC to tell additional story material, but it seems as though time has kind of healed those wounds. If we look at how purchase rates differed between those who were playing Final Fantasy XV as their first foray into the franchise and those who weren't, we can see that the veterans purchased the Season Pass at a slightly higher rate, but you'd expect that. Fans should be more invested and they should therefore be more likely to buy additional content. I guess what's interesting here is that the difference between the two segments was so minimal. We're talking about just over a 1% difference in purchasing behaviour. Moving on to the actual pieces of DLC themselves, we can see that so far, out of the ones that have been released, episode Gladiolus has been the most popular. This has been played by 64% of respondents to the survey. Episode Gladiolus is then followed by the Holiday Pack with 61%, and episode Prompto and the Booster Pack Plus, which were both at 55%. These percentages roughly match up with the Season Pass purchase rates, which makes sense as they're clearly an audience who are invested in downloadable content. What interests me about this though is how low the Holiday Pack is. I'd have expected it to have a much higher percentage because unlike the other pieces of DLC on this list, the Holiday Pack was free for an entire month. But despite that, less people apparently decided to check it out than episode Gladiolus. If we then break this down into which segments actually played each piece of DLC, things get even more interesting. With the Holiday Pack, we can see that 88% of those who played it had purchased the Season Pass, whereas only 12% of those who played it hadn't purchased the Season Pass. And if we look at that in the context of episode Gladiolus and episode Prompto, to me this says that more people were willing to pay money to pay those pieces of DLC as standalone offerings than just turn Final Fantasy XV on and play a free piece of content even though it was available for an entire month. It's also interesting to see that there were some people who bought Booster Pack Plus, even though it really didn't add that much. And as another fun fact here, 3% of respondents to the survey said that they'd purchased the Season Pass but not actually played any DLC yet. Perhaps they've just been really busy for the past 9 months. Alright, so now that we know how many people played each piece of DLC, I bet you're interested to find out what they actually thought about them. Well, the scores actually have quite a bit of deviation thanks to episode Prompto, which has to be seen as a shining light amongst what can only really be considered a deluge of mediocrity. It sounds perhaps quite harsh, but the 3 other pieces of DLC were received quite negatively by our survey respondents. Booster Pack Plus received an average score of 5.19, Holiday Pack received an average of 5.47, and Episode Gladiolus received an average of 5.81. Conversely, Episode Prompto received a 7.4, which means it scored 27.5% higher than Episode Gladiolus, and it makes it the highest rated property within the entire Final Fantasy XV universe, by quite some margin too. Final Fantasy XV as the main game was next, receiving a score of 7.02, and this was followed by Brotherhood with a score of 6.89. If we start to look at some different groupings, those who have been following the survey videos so far won't be too surprised to learn that first timers to the franchise scored each piece of DLC higher than veterans, but this time it was only by an average of 6%. The group that was actually most scathing of the DLC were those who didn't purchase the Season Pass, but instead purchased DLC independently as standalone offerings. What I find interesting about this is that they actively purchased Booster Pack Plus, Episode Gladiolus and Episode Prompto, but didn't seem to like them anywhere near as much as those who had played them after purchasing the Season Pass. Both sets of consumers obviously went in with expectations about what they'd be playing, and you'd think that the standalone players would actually have more aligned expectations as they specifically purchased packs after knowing what they were receiving. Conversely, Season Pass purchasers likely had no idea what each piece of DLC would contain when they actually purchased it, but standalone buyers were somehow more disappointed. I feel as though this is further highlighted by the Holiday Pack, a piece that was of course free. It had the lowest level of deviation when comparing the scores between the two groupings. From a regional perspective, we can also see that there is some clear differences in opinion outside of the general trends we've already observed. Players in Asia felt that the quality of the first three pieces of DLC was pretty much on par with each other, and they rated them much more favourably than those in North America or Europe. And I should note here that Europeans were the harshest on those initial three pieces of DLC. However, when it comes to Episode Prompto, we can see that although there were much higher scores across the board, it was the Europeans who now rated it relatively much higher, and it was those in Asia who scored it relatively lower. If we dive into Episode Gladiolus and Episode Prompto a bit further, we can take a look at why people felt Episode Prompto was so much better, as I asked respondents to rate the story, battle system, music, length, and gameplay. We can see that even though they were rather different from both the main game and each other, people were actually quite satisfied with the battle systems in both Episode Gladiolus and Episode Prompto, and while they did slightly prefer the guest composition of Naoshi Mizuta in Episode Prompto, music was also a point of consistency between the two pieces of DLC. It was the story, length and replay value that had the massive deviation, with each of these elements scoring around 46% higher in Episode Prompto than Episode Gladiolus. The first part of this, the story, can kind of be explained by a general feeling of apathy around Gladiolus' story arc. As we saw in the initial video, people just didn't resonate with him as a character, whereas Prompto had a much higher opinion rating. With length and replay value, well, Square Enix just had more time to get it right with Episode Prompto, and I genuinely hope it shows them the clear path they need to follow for the upcoming Episode Ignis. Speaking of which, I also asked respondents which piece of confirmed upcoming downloadable content they are most looking forward to. It's probably not too surprising that Episode Ignis won by a landslide here, receiving 67% of all the votes. It has of course been billed as the piece of downloadable content that will contain the most substance from a narrative perspective. This was then followed by Comrades, the multiplayer expansion which of course rounds out the Season Pass and has been undergoing some online tests at the moment. This received 24% of the votes. The next option isn't part of the Season Pass and was a free update that has been spoken about by Hajime Tabata, the Bestiary. This received 6% of votes, and then in last place we have those ill-fated Magitech exosuits. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at the free updates we've received that we honestly had no idea we were going to receive when Final Fantasy XV initially launched. As you can see, just over a third of respondents voted in favour of Chapter 13 Verse 2, but voting for the other options was actually quite a bit closer. 19% voted for New Game Plus, while 14% voted for the Regalia Type-D, 11% voted for Timed Quest, and 11% also voted for the improvements to the Ring of the Lucii. The only thing that people weren't too enamoured by compared to the other updates was the increased level cap. This all goes along with the viewpoint from the original video on the survey, where we saw that people weren't too happy about the delivery of the story, and Chapter 13 Verse 2 was of course created specifically as an attempt to fix the delivery of the story. So that's the third part of my Final Fantasy survey analysis complete. How did you guys feel about the DLC we've received so far as part of Final Fantasy 15? Of course, let me know in the comments below what you thought about the results, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video around for everyone else to see. For your reference, there will be a slight interlude to the survey analysis next, as I'll be doing a shorter video to highlight how people have voted against the upcoming content survey that was of course featured within the game itself. This will then be followed by the final part of my survey analysis, where I'll be looking at pre-release impressions versus post-release impressions. If you've really been enjoying these videos, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find out more information at patreon.com/FFUnion. We are fortunate that these guys have already chosen to support us, and it would be great to see this number keep on growing and growing. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos and survey analysis.